Okay, want to close the door? Thanks. Let me tell you what I'm going to do and where it came from and why I'm doing this now, why I'm pretty much out of the closet on the subject, which I've explored with some seriousness and hopefully appropriate seriousness as to methodology as well, for the last 35 years. UFOs in Government, A Historical Inquiry is the name of the book, and it is the basis for this talk. This is the book. It is big. It is nearly 600 pages, and it has nearly 1,000 documented citations, because every statement that we, the researchers who I'll discuss in a minute, use, every statement comes from the government itself and has been collected by researchers over the last 50 years using FOIA, as well as in archival work and library work and so on. So there's nothing in the book that is not documented historically. This is why it is recommended by the journal Choice, which recommends books for inclusion in academic institutions. It is recommended for every single university library in the country at all levels, and it is the only book on the subject of ufology or UFOs that is so recommended, because they recognize the rigor and the methodology and the seriousness with which we carried out our work. UFOs in Government, A Historical Inquiry is on the screen because there are two words there I want to highlight. One is, this is about government. It's about how the government responded to the phenomena of unidentified flying objects from the early 1940s forward. There were numerous unidentified flying objects prior to that time, documented in texts that we have from the 20th and 19th centuries, which describe the phenomena very much as it has been described subsequently. But that's not what we talk about. We talk about what we call the modern instantiation of the phenomena, which really began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold landed and said he had seen 9 silvery discs moving near the mountains. And he said they skipped through the air like saucers. The reporters picked up on the word saucers and called them flying saucers, which then entered the lexicon of the American people. He did not say they looked like saucers. In fact, he described them as heel-shaped with a straight trailing edge. But the point is that he saw unidentified flying objects. And we look from the 1940s forward, because that's when the government began responding in a serious and concerted way. So it's about government. There's nothing in the book about aliens. There's nothing about crop circles. There's nothing about abductions. As interesting as all those things are, including Roswell, it's an outlier, it's a one-off, and there's no documentation to support it. So therefore, all we can say is that in terms of the historical record, we cannot document, as we do everything else in the book, using the government's own words, what took place. So one key word is government, and the other is history. It's about something that's been going on for 60 or 70 years in its modern form. This is the cover of the book, and I'm just going to say briefly who these people are so you know whereof I speak. Michael Swords is a retired professor of science. His PhD was in the history of science and technology. He's recently retired from Western Michigan University. He has written scholarly articles on this subject for many years and is recognized as a leading authority in the serious academic research into the subject. Robert Powell is a career nanotechnology professional who worked with AMD and who contributed to the manufacture of Intel's major rival by doing what he could for the process by which they made chips. He organized this process, which was not trivial. He arranged for all of us to come together in Dallas about 5 years ago, to discuss what we wanted to do. What we wanted to do was make the subject respectable, despite how unrespectable unrespectable it had been made. And do that through some white papers that were academically appropriate. And we decided the only way it could be done was under Michael Swords' leadership as the main writer of this text, as a serious history work. not just a few white papers which would be neglected. The other names, the first three, are people in other countries who wrote chapters on their countries because they have been doing this work in their countries for a long time. Claus is Sweden, Vicente is Spain, Bill Chalker has been doing this in Australia for many decades. Barry Greenwood pioneered in the use of the Freedom of Information Act in the 70s in order to get documents out of the government archives, which it claimed it did not have, about subjects which it claimed it had no interest in knowing anything about. He knew that around 1980, when Reagan came in, FOIA was going to be killed as an effective means of getting information from a government that had been promised in the wake of the Watergate hearings and the Pike and Church Committee hearings in the Congress in the 70s to be more transparent. We had a brief window, and Barry pioneered in the gathering of documents, especially in his book Clear Intent, of visitations across the northern tier of SAC bases, missile bases, on both our side and the Canadian side of the border in the 1970s, about which the government said that nothing had happened and that it had no records until the records were elicited. I'm the other guy. I was just really privileged to be included in this team effort. Jan Aldrich is the pioneer of Project 1947, because 1947, when Kenneth Arnold had his sighting, there were hundreds and hundreds of other sightings that Jan decided had been never brought to light because they were in small periodicals scattered throughout the country. And that Project 1947 can be seen on the web. He was very active in Army intelligence, and he was the guy who, above all, kept us honest in terms of, if you look at the book, you'll see numerous charts and graphs showing who talked to who, how the communication flowed in the government. And of course, the government is not just one thing. The government is many facets of people politically active and competing who talk to one another about this phenomena. The Navy, the Air Force, the CIA, and other entities who had something at stake. Steve Purcell was the guy who made sure that we didn't use pictures we couldn't use and used only pictures we could use, and that was not a trivial effort either. So I want to start by saying what a UFO is not, because the cable television programs and all sorts of other kinds of mass media are full of projections of UFOs. And of course, in this area, because of the way it has developed, anybody can say anything and pretty much get away with it. It doesn't mean it has anything to do with reality. So we don't think a UFO fired on a Louisville, Kentucky police chopper and that two cops survived that amazing encounter, as this headline in a tabloid showed. And above all, I do not believe the space aliens drained his blood and filled his veins with a mysterious yellow fluid, as this shaken steel worker claimed in this National Enquirer article. You can bet he would be a shaken steel worker if that had happened. We don't think that's where you get the most honest discussions of the phenomenon. Although I can say something, if I have time, about where we do think the National Enquirer originated, where I think it originated, and how, above all, regardless of origins, how it has been used effectively by the intelligence community to discard stories and details that it didn't want to have covered in mainstream media. This is a famous picture from Paul Trent, who was a farmer in Midville, Oregon, who made two pictures of a UFO, he claimed, hovering in the sky. We find these very, very compelling. I've even talked to the people who buried Paul Trent, the mortuary people, because I do speeches a lot of places, and talked to the mortuary people who buried him and who said he claimed until the day he died that this is exactly what he saw, that he didn't know how to fake a photograph. Unfortunately, I spent actually just last week here in Vegas with a wonderful guy named Francois Louange, who was very active in France in JPON, which was their official government organization dedicated to the study of ufology for many years. And he's also worked in spy satellites and imagery analysis. And he developed a beautiful tool for analyzing photographs. And he showed us that if you use that tool, you can detect, you can't see it on the photograph, but you can detect by the way the pixels alter as you approach where it is, that there is, in all likelihood, 98% probability a couple of sigmas of probability. A fine filament connecting this alleged UFO to a power line under which it is hanging. Very disappointing. We would have loved for this to be real and Farmer Paul Trent to be sincere and honest, but this is what happens. See, in those days it was considered news. Here's a few news items, and one shows you the two pictures that Paul Trent presented. They were published in Life magazine, and then they were all over the world. If you look at this one from Rouen, France in 1957, you find it looks an awful lot like the Paul Trent second photograph. The reason is because it probably is. Someone took that photograph, altered it, and the provenance of the photograph, which originally was claimed to have been taken in 1954, then later was changed in 1957, was never established. And usually when you get a photograph of this sort, someone comes forward, because it was allegedly gun camera photography from a fighter in France that took this photograph. No one has ever come forward. So we have to conclude, unfortunately, the picture from Rouen, the picture from Paul Trent, may not really be what a UFO is. They may be something else. And this is to make the case that we couldn't be more serious about getting rid of everything spurious, fraudulent, misidentified, meteorological, or confused that has been presented in the public domain as if it was a UFO. But that leaves the question, what is a UFO? And here's a bona fide picture, which was taken in 1952 in Salem, Massachusetts, by a professional Coast Guard guy who was in his hut or cabin, and he looked out the window and he saw this and he took a photograph of it, and it happens to match the description by hundreds of people of what they have seen, which is vehicles encased in a glowing plasma flying in echelon formation at a high rate of speed through the sky, when our aircraft couldn't do what those aerodynamic vehicles were doing. So this is what we mean by UFO. This is a legitimate photograph that has never been discredited, and I think for good reason. He was inside his place of work for the Coast Guard. He looked out the window. He saw that through the window. He took a picture, and it showed up in the newspaper because people were interested in the subject then, and it had not been dismissed in the public mind as something unworthy of interest. So this is what we mean by UFOs. The modern era of UFOs began in the 1940s. It began with Foo Fighters over Germany and Japan. Some reports came back from the war theater saying that they had been tracked by radar for over 5 minutes, moving at speeds of 800 to 900 miles an hour. The military and the government claimed it had no interest officially in it, but again, using FOIA and other archival means, we have discovered they had a great deal of interest. They wanted to know what these things were. You can see the arrows in the top photo pointing to glowing orbs. You can see the glowing orbs more clearly in the bottom photo among the airplanes. They called them Foo Fighters because the French word for fire is feu, F-E-U, so they mispronounced it as foo, as Americans will, and called these glowing orbs Foo Fighters. They were white and they were red and they glowed, and they behaved apparently intelligently. They behaved much like what we would call surveillance drones these days, in that they trailed aircraft, they followed aircraft, they paced aircraft, and then they often disappeared at high rates of speed, vertically or horizontally, and disappeared from view. They never found out what they were or what they were doing, but we have documented military evidence that the military was very concerned. Why? Because we assumed they were German or Japanese secret weapons that we didn't know anything about. We only learned after the war that the Germans and Japanese suspected they might be US weapons of some kind. In other words, no nation ever was shown to have had anything to do with what we call Foo Fighters. We still don't know exactly what they were, but this is the first instance of the demonstrated unidentified flying objects of that sort of appearance that attracted the attention of the military, and 1947 is when it broke loose. As I said, that's when Kenneth Arnold saw 9 silvery discs flowing in echelon formation in and out of mountain ranges, and he tried to calibrate their speed as best he could based on what he thought, based on their angular size, how far away he thought they were. There's dispute over how big they were or how fast they were going, but he knows that he saw them. That's what he always claimed. He saw them. And lots of other people were starting to see UFOs in the late 1940s, or even a little earlier. Well, not only were people reporting them in what they called the silly season of the summer newspaper feature sections, but Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, writing to the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, Brigadier General George Shulgin, said, "It is our opinion that," and I want you to pay attention because these are his words, "it is something real. It is not visionary. It is not fictitious." See, we want to establish right away that from the very beginning, the government knew it was dealing with something that was real, not visionary or fictitious. Why? They were objects. They were physical. They were the shape often of a disc and at least as large as a man-made aircraft. The reported operating characteristics such as extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and action which must be considered evasive when sent by friendly aircraft and radar, all of this told the military that these seemed to be intelligently designed, intelligently operated, whether robotically or by active beings inside them. Aerodynamic vehicles that far exceeded anything that we could do. So of course they were paying attention. The Cold War was beginning to crank up. Europe was in rubble at this time. The world was a very, very tense place. Congressman Lyndon Johnson, at that time he was a member of Congress, he wanted to know what the story was about these things. And this is what the Army Air Force, not yet spun off as a separate service, told him. We're conducting an investigation. Detailed statements of credible witnesses are being carefully reviewed, which they were. Again, underscore, detailed statements, interrogation of witnesses, documentation of witnesses, it's all in our book, carefully reviewed, taken seriously by the government because they knew they were dealing with something real. There were so many of these reports that they had to deal with it. And the Air Force began Project Sign in 1948. Project Sign considered three hypotheses. Were they Russian? Were they American? Or were they, in their words, extraterrestrial? Because if they could do what they were observed and reported to do, and they weren't ours, and they weren't our enemies, then they probably weren't being created on Earth. Significant thing, right? So they investigated as best they could on the basis of credible reports, and they came to the conclusion they were not Russian, because the Russians were not overflying our cities and our country at will, and if they were, they would not have been doing it in this way. Americans, of course, secret weapons, secret developments could be carried out, and you know how compartmentalization works. The truth is that compartmentalization works very, very effectively. People who don't need to know don't know. Some of you may work in those areas, and you know that if you're not read in to a project, you don't really know. I had a friend at NSA who recently told me that a project on which he had worked significantly in the 1980s, which he and all those other people working on the project in the 1980s believed was about a certain thing for a particular purpose, he has just found out years later that it was for something else entirely. And he didn't know it. And they didn't know it. Because that's how effectively compartmentalization can keep even from the people who are participating in the project from knowing exactly for whom and for what purpose they are working. That's just what's so. And that national security state, in which you swim like fish all unknowing, and we all do, began in World War II with the OSS and compartmentalization and the kinds of secrecy that we have come to take for granted because the national security state, as the OSS migrated to the CIA and all the other intelligence agencies, and we have been in a state of readiness and warfare ever since. First against the communists, then against terrorists. It was Werner von Braun. This is just a spurious statement, and this is not documented. But he's allegedly told his niece, we all need enemies. The Nazis had Jews. we have communists. Next, when the communists are done and they will fail, we will have terrorists. But the terrorists can't win, and after the terrorists will come the aliens. I'm just telling you a story. That's what but meanwhile, Project Sign was a serious effort to find out what was going on. And what Project Sign decided was it couldn't be Russian, and as best they could tell, we didn't know how to do what was observed and reported by credible witnesses to being done, and they concluded in an estimate of the situation that it was extraterrestrial. They didn't say maybe it is, they said it's extraterrestrial. That was the best conclusion they could reach based on the data. They set it all the way up to the general at the top, who refused to accept this hypothesis, and he knocked it down. Now, you know, if you've worked in the military or with the military, you know very well that people in the military, when the commanding officer says, we don't accept this hypothesis, everyone salutes and says, we don't accept it either. So the hypothesis came down, and the word came down that it is unacceptable in the culture that we have and have created and will sustain to believe or state that this is the likely hypothesis that accounts for the phenomenon. So they had to come back and appoint another group to do it. They called it Project Grudge. The word signifies something about the tone of that one, because those first guys really did the best job they could in light of what they had to determine what was going on. Well, more typical Project Grudge is this press release, which they were told all press releases would conform to this policy. We have investigated and evaluated, fill in whatever blank it is, and have found nothing of value which would change our previous estimates on this subject. In other words, it was predetermined that we would reject for public consumption that the phenomena is worthy of consideration, and we would explain it for what it was. Well, some people were very unhappy with that. Chief of Air Force Intelligence Charles Cables told the Pentagon, what do I have to do to stir up action? Anyone can see we don't have a satisfactory answer to this question. I want an answer to the saucers, and I want a good answer. He never got it. Now, of course, I'm just skipping through the highlights. We have a book we created that was 600 pages, and it's a serious historical work. I'm just skipping through some of the highlights to give you an idea of how it is based on what we got from the government itself about this. Was it a mirage or hallucination, as was often claimed? Quote, it's a quote, at a distance of 130 miles northeast of Washington, June 1952, 3 radar units detected an object at 18,000 feet. The signal was strong. It was stationary for 30 minutes and then began to move. By the time it reached the edge of our scopes, it was going about 1,000 miles an hour. Our report went to the Pentagon. The order came back, another one came in, fire on it. After that first night, we loaded our anti-aircraft guns. Unusual to do in a populated area, you can bet, and scrambled F-94 jet fighters from McGuire Air Force Base. In other words, you don't issue an order to fire on something you believe is a mirage. Now, others have reported this many times. It's been my experience, I'm doing these talks in southeast Wisconsin where I live, for many groups at libraries, which are the new bookstore. And always there's somebody who waits in the back, waits until the end, until the conversation like this gives them permission to say what they have often never told anyone else in their lives. And they raise their hand and they say, let me tell you what I saw. And in one case, an old guy in his 80s in Random Lake, Wisconsin, said, I did radar in Korea. We watched them come across the scope at 1,000 miles an hour. We called in and said, should we report this? And we were told, no, it must be a malfunction of the radar. To which the response would, of course, be, then should we fix the radar? And the response came back, not necessarily, it's fine. So this is not uncommon. Many documented radar reports. It's not just people telling you what we saw. Well, that was June 52. July 52 is significant because in July 52 over Washington, D.C., for a period of 8 days, there were so many flying objects observed on the ground, by radar, by fighters scrambled from nearby bases to try to track them. One of the transcripts from the control tower, which had been denied, and then we have gotten that transcript. It's kind of fascinating. They're saying, move in on them. So this one wonderful guy, fighter pilot, tried to close on one of the glowing objects above Washington at the time. He moved toward it. And uncharacteristically, it did not move away. It, in fact, closed closer to him. And when he looked around, and you can see this on the radar screen. On the radar screen, you see the blip of the pilot, and then you see him being increasingly surrounded at closer and closer quarters by other blips on the radar screen. And he's looking around himself and saying, in effect, holy smoke, what do I do now? And then they all pardon, as if playing or making a point. The speculation on what the phenomenon is about and what it signifies is an entirely different question. We love when we get together to talk about that in light of the evidence we know and the speculation we have developed, but that's not what the book is about per se. So many sightings, the Pentagon's switchboard was jammed. There were multiple witnesses on the ground, in the air, and at multiple radar stations. And at a press conference, Major General John Samford, Chief of Air Force Intelligence, said, credible people have seen incredible things. And the Washington Post reported, that's a front page headline. Now, I include these kinds of items to show you that once upon a time it was news and reported as news by the organs of the media without question or dismissing it or ridicule. Saucer outran jet pilot reveals. Investigation on in secret after chasing Capitol. Can you imagine the New York Times, which had similar stories? I've got a lot of stories from that period that I can show you. Can you imagine the Washington Post and the New York Times running that kind of item as news today? No, you cannot. Because the context has changed, and our thesis that we developed in the course of writing the book is the context was changed deliberately and intentionally by the government for reasons. Specifically, after that, after 52, they had to get more involved, and they created Project Blue Book, which it turns out was mostly a public relations effort rather than a serious effort to study the phenomenon. J. Allen Hynek from Northwestern was hired as a resource scientist. He gave great credibility to it. He himself was very skeptical of the reports when he first signed on. He expected that all of them would likely be explained as misidentifications, meteorological phenomena, confusion, and so forth. He changed over his tenure, and I'll get into that in a minute. The CIA got involved. Don't forget, the CIA is pretty new now. They're getting involved, the Navy's involved, the Air Force is involved, the Army is involved. The CIA concluded their study, flying saucers are not a threat to national security. Now, we take great pains in many pages to show that the decisions made in the early 50s at this time, in light of these events by the Robertson panel and other subsequent groups, that they were all made in light of national security concerns. That's what the government and the military were concerned about. They were not specifically or explicitly concerned with the scientific explanation of what was being observed. That may have been taking place somewhere else, but that wasn't what they were concerned with. This was national security, and it was 1952 and 53. The Cold War was getting hot. The H-bomb was about to be, if not already, in the hands of the Soviets. The Cold War was really serious. The Russians could manipulate the phenomena in different ways or manipulate the population of the United States using the phenomena in different ways. They concluded that must not be allowed to happen. So, the flying saucers themselves are not a threat to national security, but the reports of flying saucers are. Because people could get confused, people could get upset, people could panic, people could do the War of the Worlds thing, people could become and remain anxious, and above all, people could stop trusting the powers that have been invested with responsibility for protecting the country. Think of the position of the Air Force dealing with unidentified flying objects that seemingly at will could toy with the best we could throw into the air and invade our airspace. This is the Air Force that had dominated and won World War II, and is being confronted with a challenge it could not easily dismiss or combat. And so to have that flowing through the mind of society, exacerbating the tensions of the Cold War and the high anxieties that were already in the air, was unacceptable, and that was a threat to national security. Therefore, a two-pronged approach was suggested by the CIA. Number one, we know they're real, train military personnel to observe them properly, to learn everything we can learn about them and about how they operate. In other words, take them seriously and use all of our sensor data, and you can understand why. If you're using radar and you're using gun cameras and you're using all sorts of equipment to track the details of the technological thing that you're observing, that you don't want every aunt and uncle on some farm to call in and say they saw a lighted glowing disc land behind their barn, scare hell out of their cattle, as someone in Wisconsin told me in fact happened. The cattle went through the barbed wire and cut themselves up so badly that the herd had to be destroyed. That's what everybody remembered up in Antigo, the night that glowing object landed behind this barn. They don't need that. They don't need to be told that there are objects in the sky. They know that, don't you see? By this point, they know that cold. So, train people to observe and learn, but at the same time, debunk flying saucers to the citizen. So the program began to develop of dismissing, ridiculing, and of making people, even like me, all the people that show up at the meetings that I have, the conversations like this, the presentations, and who say for the first time in their lives, as if they're deeply ashamed of what they saw over a quarry, or the object that they saw from their airplane. But hundreds, no, thousands of people all over the world report self-similar observations. But this has been very, very effective. Alan Hynek later said, the UFO phenomenon is characterized by the constant flow of reports from 150 countries. What's funny in America is not funny in 150 countries. What we report is not reported in the small granular details identically in 150 countries, just willy-nilly. Most important, he said, we have many reports from highly responsible people. You finally get to the point where you say something strange is going on, and I can't keep calling all these people liars. If there are independent witnesses, you have quite a job proving they all hallucinated. This is Alan Hynek at the end of many years of investigating reports seriously and becoming more and more and more frustrated. So that when he founded CUFOS in 1972 or 3 in Evanston, Illinois, as an independent organization, because he no longer believed the Air Force, which now was officially out of the business, which I'll talk about in a minute, you couldn't trust them. He said this after his disillusion had become complete. The public was placed in the role of the enemy against whom counter-espionage tactics must be employed. From my experience, I frequently felt those in charge considered people reporting UFOs or took a serious interest in them and wanted information about them as enemies. And here we can segue into General Alexander presenting at Black Hat just a day or two ago and being heckled for lying to Congress and saying straightforwardly, I did not lie to Congress, when we have videotapes of him lying to Congress. He was asked, are you intercepting all of this data about the American people? And he said, no, we are not. And they were. Well, in exactly the same way, the Air Force, as the lead organization in this discussion, began officially to lie to the American people. Now, you can pick nits about what the NSA is doing now. Their own explanation is that gathering all the data doesn't become intrusive until someone looks at it, and we have controls over who looks at it. I'm not going to go there. That's a whole other conversation, and I can address that based on personal knowledge And I'm not going to talk about it in detail. I'm just going to say that the way the government responded to the UFO phenomenon is similar, in Hynek's words, to the way the government is now treating the people of the United States. And only when it is confronted by outed material, a la Snowden, does policy seem to be affected differently. It's just what's so. I'm not saying anything controversial there, am I? 3 legs to the stool of disinformation and deception, according to a friend of mine who teaches at NSA, and who has said these are what we use: illusion, misdirection, and ridicule. And he chuckled and said, but the greatest of these is ridicule. Why? Because when something is hiding in plain sight, to ridicule the people who say that it's so is a most effective way of destroying their reputation, their credibility, their careers, and their ability to be viable in our society. The authoritative voice, the voice of authority, ridiculing people who say what they saw, is more effective than the people who say what they saw, even when the data accumulates and accumulates and accumulates over the years. This is the way it's done. The illusion will create things that you think are real, and they aren't. Will distract you. Look over here. Don't look at that you thought you were looking at with interest. But above all, ridicule. I have had pilots, both military and commercial, tell me that when you're standing there and someone comes down from a flight and says, I got to tell you what I saw, and they start telling you, and their superior says, you must be drunk, which would end their career, the word goes out very quickly that you don't talk about it. Well, what is a UFO? Let me throw in just one quote from the many we have in the book. Hermann Oberth was the father of German rocketry. He was Wernher von Braun's mentor, who got us to the moon with the Saturn rocket. He wrote, the accuracy of such measurements, talking about extraordinary speeds and maneuvers, is not to be doubted. These are his handwritten notes for a lecture he delivered in Germany years ago. If there were only 3 or 4 measurements, I wouldn't rely on them. But there are more than 50 on the radar of the American Air Force and the American Navy, used in all fighters. They can't all be so inaccurate that the information obtained from them can be doubted completely. Now, again, I want to underscore, he has seen radar reports from more than 50 fighters, Navy and Air Force, and it is to that he refers when he discusses the data that they gathered. And it is so fascinating to those of us who've been part of this for so many years. The sociological and the psychological phenomena of the 20th century, 21st century, and even some of you, I'm sure, are sitting there saying, hard to get our minds around the factuality of it, the undeniable, ineluctable factuality of it, as documented year by year, incident by incident, report by report, and how effectively ridicule has undermined the ability of us to believe what we even see with our own eyes. Let me tell you how that works. I was talking to someone the other day about this, and I was telling him how very often, at least one, often several more, come up after presentations at these library talks, which are really well attended. And he said, are the people who tell you these things, are they normal? Are these normal people? And of course, 3%, I used to be in the ministry, and I know 3% of every congregation is crazy. 3% of any crowd is probably 3, well, 1.5 of you. 3% are not what you mean by normal, but most are. Most are normal people who know what they saw, report what they saw with some clarity and fidelity, and they're accurate in the details, and they are consistent across countries and years and so on. And he said, 20 minutes later, he suddenly changed the subject and he said, I saw a UFO. And I said, before we get to the details of your sighting, let's look at what your mind did. You compartmentalized your own experience, like someone who has been abused and dissociates their experience from their own ready apprehension of it. And you put it over here while you ask me if people who see those things are normal, and you are them. You are one of them. But you couldn't integrate that fact that you are one of them until permission had been given to consider the kinds of people who report these things to be normal rather than abnormal, so that you could shift in your own subjective field of interpretation of your own experience that you are a normal person instead of an abnormal person. That's what it does when it's reinforced so effectively. And that's what's been done. Well, this is hard to read, but I'll tell you what he said. This is what Oberth was talking about. The appearances are disks. Sometimes they place one on the other, form a scar, and fly away with high speed. They always fly in the manner of a drive, as if the drive is perpendicular to the plane of the disk. When they're suspended over certain terrain, they keep horizontal. When they want to fly quick, they tilt up, plane forward, go like this. How does he know that? Because they've been observed so many times. In sunlight, brighter than their own gleaming, they appear glittering like metal. They're dark orange and cherry red at night. If not much power is necessary for movement, like when they're suspended, calm, then they don't shine much. But if more power is necessary, shining increases or brightens, they go yellow, yellow-green, green like a copper flame, and the state of the highest speed acceleration is extremely white. In other words, that's what he was talking about when he said, I've seen over 50 reports. That's why he accepted the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Now, he's not the only one. I just throw this in to say what we're talking about is science that could have been done, probably has been done, should be done on the facts at hand. Paul Hill worked at NASA for many, many years, several decades. And he had his own sightings and heard within from others about UFO sightings, including from astronauts. And he wrote a book called Unconventional Flying Objects. NASA told him he could continue his activities and gather those reports as long as he never said anything about it. Because the official NASA position is that there's no such thing as UFO. We don't deal with that. We have a different mission and a different task. And after he died, his daughter Julie took his manuscript and edited it, and it was published as Unconventional Flying Objects. He was a scientist, and the book is fascinating to read. You can get it. It's from Hampton Roads Publishing. And he did the best science and physics he could with it, as have others in my awareness. All UFO colors, he said, stem from energetic ionizing radiation. In other words, this is not magic. It's radiation generated by the UFO which ionizes the air. Least energy, red and orange, just as Oberth had said. There are also two most common colors associated with low power operations, such as hovering. Blue requires a higher activation energy. Blue, white, blue and white and blue-white are the common colors at high power. Blue corresponds to the strong radiation peaks of nitrogen. You can get his book and look at his well-intentioned, maybe not always successful, but damn good attempt to apply the physics he knew of the day to what was being observed in order to understand something about the propulsion systems and the electromagnetic energies generated and what was happening to gravity in its presence, so that whatever was inside the craft was not mashed against the wall and killed, as we would be if we took the G's of accelerating from 0 to 1,000 the way these vehicles take those G's. So, during the 50s, Project Blue Book debunked cases. It often used explanations that were ridiculous. If it said something was Venus, and someone pointed out that Venus hadn't risen yet, they would just change it to a temperature inversion. And yet an RB-47 bomber, in one of the best cases we have because it's so thoroughly documented, was paced for hours by an unidentified object. Aircraft and ground radar, as well as visuals, confirmed the event. There's no file in Project Blue Book on it. One of the reasons Hynek became disillusioned is he became convinced that the best cases, the real cases, the important cases went somewhere else. And what Blue Book was doing was public relations. Skip that one because time is marching on. Well, there were waves in which so many people saw them, so many newspapers covered it, so many photographs were in evidence that they decided we had to deal with this scientifically. And to make a very long story, in one of the best chapters in this wonderful book, to make that story short, the Colorado Project, the Condon Committee, was appointed. They were the only university that would undertake the effort in 1969. And the committee investigated the entire phenomenon. Unfortunately, Ed Condon, who headed the committee, never did any of the work himself. And since he wrote the conclusion, which was that there was nothing to UFO phenomena of interest, he couldn't have read the 1,500 pages which his committee had assembled as the report, because the report included many unknowns and unexplained instances that his conclusion didn't take into account. But what it did do, the Condon Committee, was enable the Air Force to do what it wanted to do, which was get out of the public business of saying we're dealing with UFOs, and they said we're not dealing with UFOs anymore. They've already shown, and this is an academic committee, that there's nothing to it. Condon himself is on record as having sent a memo before the committee began its work, in which he said, pretty much, and I paraphrase, we pretty much, what our task is. It is to give the public the appearance that we're doing science before we arrive at the conclusion that there is nothing to this at all. Some of his committee quit and wrote their own books and their own minority reports afterward. And Alan Hynek founded CUFOS in protest. But the cases did not go away. I mentioned those cases in the 70s. There's one on the web, on Minet. The Tom Tulin in Minneapolis did an extraordinarily well-documented case, and he did a beautiful job of taking all witness testimony to Minet Air Force Base, because these guys were scared by what was happening. I refer you to that yourself, same as Loring. The government said they didn't have any documents on it, but the Freedom of Information Act elicited 24 documents describing a B-52 bomber crew on the ground observing an object 300 feet away and 5 feet above the ground, hovering. The fact is that from the 50s forward into the 70s, and it hasn't stopped, the official decision was to debunk, to dismiss, to ridicule, and to lie, while somewhere else, something else, unless they're completely crazy, is going on. September 76, the case is a famous one from Tehran, where there was a dogfight. Some of you are too young to know that Tehran was once our friend, and we gave them a lot of aircraft. And so they had the best fighters in the air, and one of them drew a bead on a UFO over Tehran. And the general who was present at that event came to a news conference in Washington, D.C., and discussed what he experienced during the event, because when the plane locked its armaments on the unidentified object, the armaments were immediately disarmed. And there are numerous reports of interesting events with nuclear missiles across the whole northern tier. Well, it's a complex phenomenon. I don't mean to imply any conclusive statement about that by just pointing out that we have numerous points of data, numerous instances from which we can begin to do real science. And wouldn't it be ridiculous if something that so challenges and confronts the population of the country and the earth with this phenomena were not explored in depth and in detail? Well, perhaps it has, perhaps it hasn't. The Alaska case is another famous one. I don't have a lot of time. I'll just say that I'll conclude with this. It's recommended for inclusion in university libraries because it stands out. This wonderful book, which I'll be glad, of course, to say as an exception. The price is the same. The publisher did this as a labor of love like the rest of us. He did it because he wanted this beautiful historical analysis out there, and his margins are very thin. So whether you get it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or him or me, it's all the same price, $30. It's an exception. 1,000 citations, 600 pages. Illuminates how the government responded. Minimal speculation. Nothing about aliens. And yet, if you see the nose of a camel inside the tent, wouldn't it occur to you that there might in fact be a camel? So we encourage you to not only look at how the government responded, but look at that to which they responded and infer for yourselves why they responded as they did. It's complex, many-faceted. It was used as cover and disinformation in many cases where secret projects were masked by allowing people to believe it was UFO phenomenon. But the data just doesn't go away. And those of us who have gotten hooked in wanting to know about this, we all had some instance that started us. For me, it was 1978. It was 35 years ago. I was sitting in the church basement I was a clergyman then, Episcopal clergyman, in my new first parish on the edge of an Air Force base. And I was sitting in the church basement with then a major, left the Air Force as a colonel, heavily decorated fighter pilot, great guy, all the right stuff. The two of us sitting there, and I said, you know, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the movie is in the multiplex in Ogden at the time. I said, Bob, what's the story? I read Alan Hynek and Jacques Vallée and these other guys, and they say you chase these things and you can't catch them. And he looked perplexed and he looked away, which was not his usual mode, which was cocky, and he said, well, that's right. He said, we chase them and we can't catch them. And that occasioned for me a contextual shift in my understanding of what we were dealing with. It wasn't just fun. It wasn't just sexy. It wasn't just, ooh. It wasn't just sci-fi. It wasn't just interesting. Someone I knew well, a credible person, and an Air Force fighter pilot, told me that it was real. And I've spent the next 35 years using the conversations I've been able to have with people, both as a clergyman and subsequently for the last 20 years, as someone who goes all over the world speaking about technology and security and intelligence issues, with people in a wide range of work who have done nothing to disabuse me of what I'm trying to tell you motivated me to take place in this project because it's worthwhile to do. It confronts us, it challenges us, it puzzles us. It's not all just one thing, and we don't have all the answers, but it's impossible to put it down. So it's essential, just like when we sent people up to Hubble, it was taking pictures and they were blurry. That's what we get from the government so often. And so we needed to recalibrate the mirrors of the telescope so that we could compensate for the skew and the distortion and see the stars and galaxies for what they are. It's the same kind of enterprise in daily life in 21st century, not only America, but all over the world. In order to know what's real, you have to do the work. Until you do the work, you believe anything. Any questions? Sir?
Yeah, you said something about the National Enquirer earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was hard to elaborate on that.
Well, it's just kind of fun to speculate, okay? Because the National Enquirer is a journal that when it began in 1953, printed very disreputable stuff, like the stuff we looked at. It's bad stuff. Part of my growing up has been continually being disabused of what I thought was so. And I'll tell you the story just very quickly. I did an honors writing class with Stephen Spender, an English poet, literary guy, and he edited Encounter magazine. For 20 years, Encounter magazine, probably haven't heard of it, but it was the leading non-communist left intellectual periodical in England. It was really, really good. And it wasn't until a book called The Cultural Cold War was written, Who Paid the Piper is the English title, written by an English woman, that I learned that Encounter magazine was completely funded by the CIA through covert foundations like the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation and others. And that about 20 other major periodicals in the world at the time were also so funded because the CIA had appointed itself a Ministry of Culture. And it not only funded these excellent publications, as well as expositions of abstract expressionist art. That's a whole other wonderful story to counter Soviet socialist realism. But it also funded garbage publications. So when John Kenneth Galbraith in India learned to just hate this one publication like the Enquirer tabloid, He demanded his staff find out who was putting this out, who was the Indian publisher. It turned out to be completely a covert CIA operation. So we have instantiations that this is the way it is done. You place stories and things, and that's just the way it's done. So in 1953, the National Enquirer started by Generoso Gene Pope. It didn't make money for years. Every year, hundreds of thousands of dollars came through. Frank Costello, head of the Mafia in New York, to sustain the magazine until the 60s when it survived on its own. And in 1952, you could ask, what did Gene Pope do before he decided to start the Enquirer? And it's in his resume. He did psychological operations for the CIA. And I'm just saying, isn't that interesting? Because when the Malmstrom Air Force Base case broke, it wasn't covered for 4 years by media until finally it was covered in the National Enquirer, and that killed the story. So I just find it interesting to speculate about it. It's just speculation. Okay? They're giving me the throat, slash the throat kind of sign. So, anybody wants to ask other questions? I got to go over to Caesar's for dinner with my buddies. But anybody has questions? I've got lots of business cards, and they're free. And what they have on them is a phone number, and an email address, and a website, and all that. So anybody wants to contact me, I'll be at DEF CON tomorrow doing a talk similar to this, maybe a little less freewheeling. Come get a card if you want. If you'd like to look at the book, come look at it. If you want one, they're $30. They'll be for sale at DEF CON. You can turn that off. Is that off?